Hey there, welcome to AP US History with Lennox, and today we are talking about one of my favorite topics in US history, the creation of the United States Constitution. Now, as many of you are aware, or maybe you're not, so I'll just remind you, the Constitution was not the first government of the United States. That honor belongs to the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were drafted and ratified in the midst of the American Revolution, and they were successful in the sense that they got us through the American Revolution. However, over time, we've quickly learned that they were actually broken, and they needed to be replaced. There were several main concerns with the Articles. Number one was the federal government was extremely weak, and it didn't have the tools it needed through the Articles to deal with some of the problems that our young nation was facing. First of all, our foreign policy was kind of going to pot. With the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, we thought we were well on our way to establishing ourselves within the world. However, some of the key players in that treaty were just ignoring what they promised. For instance, the English had promised to leave the American frontier, yet they still inhabited the forts in the West, and on top of that, they're starting to arm the Native Americans. The Spanish had agreed to give everyone free trade along the Mississippi River. Well, now they've banned that, and our Western farmers depend on the Mississippi to get down to the Gulf of Mexico. Finally, France, who had been our #1 ally during the American Revolution, they're calling in the loans that they gave us to get through the revolution. They want to get paid back. And then if that wasn't enough, go over halfway around the world to the northern coast of Africa, and our trade and merchant vessels that are heading into the Mediterranean Sea are being attacked by Barbary pirates, and we don't have a force to stop that. Here at home, our economy was kind of in the dumper. We didn't have a common currency amongst all the states. Rebellions were starting to rise up. Shays' Rebellion is really kind of what put the spotlight on this idea that we needed to change our government. If you remember correctly, Shays' Rebellion was a revolt by farmers in western Massachusetts, and when they revolted against the Massachusetts government, we had no system in place to put down the rebellion. If we can't control rebellions within our country, what would we do if a foreign entity attacked us? A huge problem. And finally, trade barriers, not just with international trade, but with trade between the states. There were no regulations, no rules for trade going across state lines. That had to be addressed as well. George Washington captured all of this in one line that he wrote within a letter to James Madison. Speaking of our country, he said, "We are either a united people or we're not. If the former, let us act as a nation. If we are not, let us no longer act as a farce by pretending to it." What Washington's saying is simply this: are we the United States of America? If we are truly united, then we better start working together like we are united. But if we're not, if we want to maintain state sovereignty and independence, let's just call it what it is and go on about our merry way and have 13 independent state nations. I mean, that's what he's saying. There were some states who started to make a move towards repairing the Articles. It started with the Annapolis Convention in 1786, where 5 different states come together with their delegates to try to deal with the trade issues amongst the states. But they realized rather quickly, number one, anything we decide here is not going to carry over to all 13 states. So what we really need to do is get everyone together and address this as a unit. And so that's when the idea of the Philadelphia Convention came up. They said, we're going to meet 1 year later in Philadelphia, and we're going to get the other states involved. Now, the sole purpose from the beginning was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Just fix the Articles. You don't have to get rid of them. It's not going to work. There's just too many problems with the Articles of Confederation. So what they determined, we need to start from scratch. We just need to start over completely. Let's go ahead and review what the Articles of Confederation, what they said, how they were structured, and where the weaknesses lied. If you remember correctly, a confederation is just this league of friendship. And the sovereignty under this government belongs to the states. The states had all the power. The federal government really had none. The only governing body that the federal government had was a legislative body, and every state had one delegate that was present within that legislature. So all the states had equal representation. Only the states had the economic power to tax. The federal government didn't hold that power. Now, the power the federal government did hold: foreign relations, building a military, declaring war. They could appoint ambassadors. They could negotiate treaties. And while all that sounded good, really it was only power on paper. I would argue that the only real power that the federal government had was appointing ambassadors and negotiating treaties. Other than that, raising an army or navy, they could do it, but how are they going to pay for it if they can't tax? And so you can kind of see where the problem lies. If they wanted to make new laws, you needed 2/3 of the states to agree it. If you wanted to change or amend the Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous, all 13 states. So you can see where the holes are in this government. There wasn't enough power for the federal government, and to change it, you had to get all the states to agree. And why would the states agree to give the federal government more power when they hold all the power? So that's going to be the basis going into the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The first thing they're going to look at is creating a legislative branch. That's what they already have. So how can we make that better? And when you look at the legislative branch, it's really all about representation. Who has the most power in the legislature? Now, there was this idea floated about that maybe we should base our representation in the legislative branch on population. So large states, because of their, and I'm not talking geographically large, but I'm talking population large. So large states, because of their population, should have more representation in the government. Well, that sounds good on the surface, but the small states are going to argue, but how will we be heard if we have limited representation? Because the large states are going to outnumber us every single time, and our voices are just going to get dwarfed in all of theirs. At the same time, we have another division slowly starting to evolve in our country, and it's very slow at this point, but it's the debate between slave states and free states. Now, let me be very clear here. This is not a debate about the question of slavery. This is a debate about how we should count slaves. And the idea is slave states felt if we're going to talk about representation based on population, slaves should count towards population. Whereas states that had started implementing freedom or, abolishing slavery, they're like, no, why should you get those extra voices? Why should you get those extra numbers? Because slaves are property. They should not count towards representation. If you look at statistics from the 1790 census, you can really see which states benefited from representation by population. You can also see which states are going to benefit should slaves count towards that population. I mean, look at Virginia. Virginia's population was 747,000 people. Of that, nearly 300,000 are going to be slaves. If those slaves don't count, that's going to drop their population where they're not going to get this, they're not going to get the same number of representatives. They're going to be, less representatives than several northern states. So this is why the debate was so heavy about counting slaves. Is look at this, look at the predominantly southern states. Now, you can look and see that every single state, with the exception of Massachusetts, had slaves, but look at who would benefit the most from slaves counting towards population, and that's primarily the southern states, those states south of the Mason-Dixon line. Two plans are going to be introduced for the legislative branch of our country, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Now, the Virginia plan is going to be introduced by James Madison from Virginia. And he's going to say what we really need here is a legislative branch similar to England's. The Parliament is run by the House of Lords and the House of Commons, two bodies within the main legislative branch. That's what we call a bicameral legislature, two. And he said that both of these houses should be based on, the representatives there should be based on population. The New Jersey plan is going to be introduced by William Patterson, also known as the small state plan. He says, no. The way the legislative branch is set up right now under the Articles is fine. One house, and we should have equal representation. One vote per state. That way, everyone has an equal voice. And this is really, guys, what it's boiling down to, is who will have the loudest voice or who will have the most voting power in the legislative body. If it's based on population, the large states are going to have more voting power. If it's, equal representation, the small states they'll all have equal power, but the small states will be right in there with them. So how do we share all this power? How do we determine which plan is the best? And that's the challenge that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, this is what they faced. Well, one man stood up and said, oh, wait, I have a plan too, and that was going to be Alexander Hamilton. Except Hamilton's plan was nothing close to either the Virginia or the New Jersey plan. His plan was, why are we even talking about representation and stuff like that? States shouldn't have any power at all. All the power should go to the national government. Hamilton was absolutely a nationalist. He believed in a very big, very strong central government. Hamilton's going to be permitted to present his plan, but as a junior member, he's going to be pretty much laughed out of there. They're not even going to take a vote. They're not even going to discuss Hamilton's plan. So what do? Roger Sherman is going to step up from Connecticut. He goes, I have an idea. Let's take a little bit from both. Let's create a bicameral legislature. Let's have a House of Representatives and a Senate. The House of Representatives is going to be based on population, meaning the larger states are going to have more representation within the House of Representatives. However, in the Senate, every state, 2 votes, equal representation. On top of that, we're going to give the people more power and we're going to give the states more power because the House of Representatives, those representatives will be voted in by the people. But just to make sure the states feel like they're being represented the way they deem necessary, the state legislatures will determine who will go to the Senate. That's the difference between a direct election and an indirect election. A direct election is when the people directly vote to send someone to the government. An indirect election is basically what happened here is the people of the state voted for their state legislatures, and then those legislatures used that power to choose senators. But either way, we have the small states are represented in this plan, and the large states are represented in this plan. But there's one other compromise. There's one other question. How do we count population? What about the slaves? Should they be counted for the purpose of representation in the lower house, in the House of Representatives? Now, obviously, the slave-holding states are going to be like, well, yeah. But the non-slave-holding or the states on the path to abolition are going to say no. And again, it's not about the slaves themselves. It's about having power within the legislative body. And the more people who come from your state, the more people like you, the more power you'll have. Here's what they came up with, the 3/5 compromise. The idea is we're not going to count every single slave as population. We'll just count 3/5 of them. So if you take the full slave population, for instance, Virginia, nearly 300,000 slaves, we're only going to count 3/5 of those. So what does that mean? That means of the 300,000 slaves in Virginia, 180,000 will count towards population. They don't get the full boost from it, but they get a pretty big chunk. So what does the North get, or what does the non-slaveholding states get out of this? They get more power in the federal government with regards to the question of slavery. Again, not abolishing it, but dealing with the trade, the economics of it. And what they get is the power to end the international slave trade coming into the United States in 20 years. The international slave trade obviously had been going on for a while. Remember triangular trade. And most European countries and South American countries had been getting slaves from Africa. What we started to see in the late 1700s going into the early 1800s is most European countries ended being part of the international slave trade. So the United States is really kind of slow coming to this game. But they agree that for 20 years they will still allow the international slave trade to take place in America, but in 1808 it will completely come to an end. And that's kind of how that compromise went. One thing, one pause right here. The word slave appears nowhere in the original Constitution. In fact, the practice of slavery is not even addressed until the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865. However, the structure of the Constitution is going to protect the institution and the practice of slavery in our country until that 13th Amendment is passed. So that's the legislative branch. We've determined how the legislative branch is going to be structured, and if you want more information, you can read Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. But the other thing they did at the Constitutional Convention was create two other branches. The second one being the executive branch, or the presidency of our country. The executive branch is going to be created under the guise that we don't want someone or one person to have absolute power. And we're going to look at how we actually select the president. There was debate. Who should choose the president? It can't be the legislative branch. Congress can't choose the president because then the president is responsible just to Congress. There was fear about letting the people choose the president because, quite honestly, the founders did not think the people were educated enough to wisely choose. So this is when they came up with the Electoral College, where it's going to be another form of representative democracy where electors will represent the states and go and cast their ballot for the president based on how their state voted. And so what you have happen is you have each state will send the number of electors based on their senators and representatives. So every state has 2 senators. So that's 2 electors that every state has. But every state has different numbers of representatives based on their population. So based on those 2 numbers, that's how you determine how many electors each state has. Well, so why did they do this? Why did they just set up this electoral college rather than just doing it straight democratically where everyone just votes or have an appointment or whatever? Why did they choose the Electoral College? Number one is they didn't want a huge popular influence on the office of the presidency. They feared that too much democracy would lead to mob rule, that those who were on the minority side would often be pushed out of society because the mob was controlling everything. And so they wanted to protect the minority opinion as much as they wanted to get the majority opinion. That's why we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. And that's why the Electoral College is going to be set up. In the end, what's going to happen is the large states, they're just going to get more electoral votes. That's how they benefit from all of this. But the small states, they will also be heard. And not just heard, but listened to. Their voice is going to matter. When you look at the electoral map today, You can see where the high population areas are. Basically, California, Texas, Florida, New York. These are the states that have the most electoral votes. But you can also see how a California could completely outvote half of the country in that middle section with their 55 electoral votes. In order to win the presidency, a candidate must get 270 electoral votes. And let's say that the candidates got every single large state, say California, Texas, New York, Florida. You can even throw in Pennsylvania and Illinois. That's still not enough to win the presidency. Let's say they get all the small states' votes. That's also not enough to win the presidency. So what the Electoral College does is the candidate has to win both, support from large states and smaller states. This way, everyone is heard in the election. Now, is it a perfect system? No, it's not. There have been several elections in our history where if you took the popular vote numbers, they don't match the result of the electoral vote numbers. But more times than not, this system has worked and every voice has been heard. And that's the importance here, is that every voice is heard. So for instance, the state of Wyoming, that's my home state. We have 3 electoral votes. 3. But our votes matter too. Our voice is heard too. As loud as California's is, as loud as New York's is. And that's the importance of the Electoral College. There's always going to be debate about the Electoral College, but it's a system that our founders thought would best serve the population, the public, fairly and evenly. Beyond the executive branch, and if you want more information about the executive branch, you can read Article 2 of the Constitution. The final branch of government is going to be the Judicial Branch, Article 3 of the Constitution, and that's what establishes the Supreme Court of the United States. It has the judiciary power of our federal government. With regards to changing the Constitution or amending the Constitution, if you remember correctly, under the Articles, you needed a unanimous decision. Not the case here. Here we need 2/3 of the government to agree. So 2/3 of the House and the Senate have to vote for the amendment, plus 3/4 of the states as well. So when Congress decides they want to change the Constitution and they get a 2/3 majority in both houses, they then propose that change to the states. And the states can determine, yes, we want it, or no, we don't. So they can either ratify or accept the amendment, or they can reject it, and it just ceases to exist. It doesn't become part of the Constitution. So let's do a real quick wrap up here, comparing the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution so you can see the differences between the two. When it comes to sovereignty or who holds the power, under the Articles, it was absolutely the states. Under the Constitution, it's shared power between the states and the federal government. One thing you should know, if it's not in the Constitution, anything not listed in the Constitution, that power belongs to the states. Foreign relations are going to be controlled by the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. It's going to be the same with the Constitution. It just makes sense to have our federal government deal with foreign countries. Taxation, only the states could tax under the Articles. Both the state and the federal government can tax under the Constitution. With regards to interstate commerce and trade, well, the states tried to control that under the Articles, but there was no oversight. Under the Constitution, interstate trade is governed by the federal government. Inter meaning trade between the states. Intra-state trade, or is trade within a state, that's governed by the state itself. Under the Articles, every state had 1 vote. Representation under the Constitution was proportional in the House of Representatives, but every state had 2 votes, or 2 representatives in the Senate. So you had both proportional and equal representation. In order to make laws under the Articles of Confederation, you needed 2/3 of the states to agree. Under the Constitution, you just need a concurrent majority. So 51% of both the House and the Senate have to agree, and the president has to agree as well. He has to sign off. If he doesn't sign off on a law, that's called the power of veto. That is one of the checks and balances between the Congress and the president. And finally, if you want to amend the Constitution, well, under the Articles of Confederation, everybody needed to agree. Under the Constitution, 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states have to agree before we can change it. So that's it. Quick overview of how the U.S. Constitution came to be. The biggest question, obviously, was representation. And again, it was all about power and who was going to hold it. Hopefully, you have a little bit more of an understanding about our Constitution, maybe a little bit more about the Electoral College. If not, you can always rewind and watch again. Otherwise, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.